Herzlich willkommen zur heutigen Sitzung, zu einer sehr spannenden Sitzung. I will switch into English because we say that we will have today's lecture in English. And it's my pleasure to be co-host today and to introduce our speaker to you. Before that, some short remarks. The session is a cooperation between the Center of Open and Responsible Research and the Berlin Center for Global Engagement. Both are part of the Berlin-University Alliance. And Professor Fernanda Weigel, who I will introduce in a moment, will be our speakers today. Unfortunately, our discussant, Dr. Ertug Tomasz from Humboldt-University, had to resign from his commitment on short notice. We nevertheless expect an interesting discussion on the basis of the students' questions and our own, of course. So let me introduce today's speaker. Professor Fernanda Weigel is a social scientist by training and a principal investigator at the Argentinian National Council for Scientific and Technical Research. She is also an appointed professor at the National University of Cuyo and has been a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for European Sociology in Paris, among other research positions. I think that your biography or your text that the students were asked to read speaks quite interestingly to your own biography as being employed by the. Her interest lies at sociology of sciences, which has brought about numerous studies on international knowledge production in the periphery, so-called periphery, bibliometric approaches, and studied on the evaluation of research careers in Argentina and university rankings in general. Her research has been honored with several awards, including the Mention of Honor for Scientific Value by the Argentinian Senate in 2017. One of her recent work includes her edition of key text of Latin American sociology, from which you were invited to read the introduction. I speak to the students among you. Today's lecture, I guess, will also draw on her book, The Politics of Academic Autonomy in Latin America. Moreover, Fernanda Weigel is involved in activities strengthening an open ecosystem in Latin America, fostering open access and a community-driven approach. Given her expertise, she was elected as the chair of the Open Science Advisory Committee of the UNESCO. The community was responsible for preparing the UNESCO recommendations on open science that were adopted by the international organization only last year. So I'm very happy to have you here today. We are all, and I hand over the floor to you and come back with many questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm going to start by saying thank you to Stefan Pimer and Romain for this invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm very sorry to be speaking English. I would prefer to speak Spanish, of course, but German is impossible. So here I am with English. And first of all, I would like to say that the students received 3 texts that are related to maybe 15 or 20 years of research towards academic knowledge and the inequalities in the world academic system. But especially because I wanted to have this dialogue today, I didn't send so many texts related to open science and my own overview on that, because that's what I'm going to present today. And I'm going to try to make this relationship between academic autonomy, interculturality, and open science, which is something that I really haven't thought so much before until this conference that I prepared, and I hope that we can do that together. And so I'm just going to put my watch there, just not to pass too much on time. And so I was saying that, first of all, I was very challenged by the idea of thinking on open science and academic freedom. And that was the first proposal that I received. And I started to give that a few rounds, and I thought that it was important to think on academic autonomy. And I'm going to try to explain why I'm working with the concept of autonomy and not only freedom, even if it is one of the concepts that is around the idea of autonomy, and also interculturality. And you may know that open science is a concept that has been there for maybe 2 or 3 decades already. More known is open access. But open science, it has its own history. Open science is at least a movement that started in the 1970s and 80s. And with the first library, the Gutenberg project, with all the first processes of digitalization. But in the last years, the idea of open science and the open science movement has come to what we can call consolidation, or in some way an expansion of the concept and of the movement. And so we could say that the COVID pandemic helped this, because the need of open science and the need of open access was accelerated. The recommendation of open science made by the UNESCO was a very important moment, because we could get there a consensual definition. And I was, as Stefan was saying, I was the chair of this advisory committee that was created at the UNESCO in 2020. And we worked for 2 years in order to prepare this project, this first draft that was discussed in the conference in 2021. And I think that is interesting that here we could make like a review of the process of the discussion of the concept of open science, and particularly the role by the Global South and the Global Southern countries in that advisory committee and in that process of discussion. And so it's true that the recommendation was very important. It was critical for the discussions and for the movement. And it is a very important milestone. We have a consensual definition in the text of the recommendation, shared principles and values, and a set of actions. But you may ask yourselves, well, this idea of openness was an idea to open to what? And it was not only open access as the main or always important issue, you know, to immediate open access to publications, also, of course, open data and other ways of opening research, as, for example, open code and software, etc., and the relation with open educational resources. But it was also in the main discussion, the idea of opening to society, to other social sectors, the concern behind the scarce social interaction that science has had in the last decades with what we call, I'm not even sure if this is English, we call academicism, which is this obsession, you know, with the impact factor of our publications, and the terrible competition that the research assessment is placing in between us with the indicators, the bibliometric indicators, and how this has made science a bit more distant from society and from social needs. And so that was a particular issue that was important for the peripheral or semi-peripheral countries in this discussion. And so this also takes us to the need to think on the third important part of open science, which is citizen science. We're going to talk about this a lot in a minute, but it comes to the social responsibility of science and to what is expected from science, talking from the society, but also what type of participation are we asking society, social sectors to have? Are we just inviting them? You know, is citizen science only this type of projects in which you see that the people that work in the beaches can help a scientist to collect material? Is that only citizen science? Well, in the Latin American perspective, this is not really what we are expecting of participatory type of science. We are expecting something different, and I think that's where social science and sciences and humanities have a very important role. I'm going to go back to that in a minute. So if we now take into account the whole discussion and the text that you finally can see in the recommendation of UNESCO, you're going to see in your left in this presentation that we have in red all the tensions and the inequalities that were placed in the table in the discussion. For example, the digital divide, the differences, the developmental inequalities that mark the type of openness and the possibilities that each country can have and each academic community can have on this idea of openness to the world. The problem of English as the unique code for interoperability, because if we're going to have infrastructures that are working with an English code, then what's happening with multilingualism? What I was saying about academicism, and the problem of research assessment, which is, and I hope to come back to this at the end, which is like we normally say the Gordian knot. I don't know if the Gordian knot would be in English, like a very difficult thing to solve, which is the research assessment, because this is part of the culture in the socials, in the scientists around the world. There is a high belief in each one of us, and in this indicator of supposed excellence or quality. And so it is very difficult to fight against some of the noxious effects of impact factor. And of course, a consequence of open access at this moment, which is the fact that if you recall what the Plan S is, the coalition is, the idea of open access for Europe was fulfilled through a policy that preferred open access for the journals, but also imposed the APC, or BPC, which is the article processing charges. And so many journals have come to the immediate open access, but not in a free way. I mean, before we had to pay to read, and now we're paying to publish. And this is particularly complicated for the South, or the global South, or for peripheral countries, because we hardly can pay the subscription for our libraries. I mean, just to read, and we're hardly paying that. So imagine what it is to pay maybe 2,300, 2,000 or 3,000, or sometimes even 5,000 for publishing one article, right? And it is just like there is an ethical thing also. Why, if I am paid by public funds to make this research, and I publish it and I have to pay, and who am I paying? I mean, there is like a critical issue there. And so to your right, I've just put in green all the things that the text in the recommendation is are proposing in order to try to create a path for open science that is really an open science for an open world and for a more equal type of open science. The collaborative infrastructures, you're going to see that in Latin America, we have a lot of this and we can push them. Multilingualism, interculturality, bibliodiversity, because of course, again, the papers and all this obsession is taking books and other formats of publications aside. Citizen science, of course, and the idea to replace impact factor with social impact or social relevance. And the two forms that we can work in a different manner with APC, which is diamond and green access to publications. Just to say a few words on this inequality that we find for infrastructures and other very important things to advance in open science for the global South. If you see here the global distribution of open science repositories, which is like, the main basis to try to work on an open science collaboration, to your left, it is in your left, yes, you're going to see the institutional production repositories, which is the repositories that had replaced maybe 30 years, 40 years ago, the common libraries of our universities. So there you have, for example, I'm going to ask you to focus in South America because I'm going to focus on that later, or in the South. But you're going to see that on your left, South America has a very dark blue color, because the more dark blue you get, it's the more amount, the more quantity of repositories you have. So it is really pretty good for South America. Africa is, of course, in another color. It's very, very light. But if you go to the right and to the other figure, you're going to see that the data repositories are very few in the South. And you can see the difference between South America in the very dark blue on your left and the more light blue on your right, because we are not advancing in the same speed on data repositories. Instead, in the North, this is really advancing very fast. Also, the global distribution of the CRIS systems which are very important infrastructure because these are the current research information systems that have been created to reunite the information that was in two different systems, the repositories that I mentioned before, and the management systems. I don't know here in Germany if you have like these databases for curriculum and the information of people that is normally in the management side. And you also have the information on projects or institutions. And normally this is always divided, the repositories for the production and the data for the people, the projects, the institutions in another place. And so the CRIS is the way that we reunite everything. And so if I am going to go, for example, for an article from Stefan, I have to find everything. I have to find your name, and that has to link to your curriculum, and that has to link to your projects and to your institution and everything. Well, as you can see in the Global South in general, Africa, almost nothing, but in South America, we only have 14 CRIS systems. Instead, in Europe, well, the numbers are not really clear, but you have 230 in Eastern, in West Europe, in North, in Norwegian, all this region, like 180. And I'm going to come back to that later. I think in Latin America, we can have a very good perspective in CRIS systems, but in a national scope, not in an institutional level. And now the other very important issue in the global scale, which is this transformative academic publishing industry. I was saying this is one of the things that open access is very risky because it can deepen the inequalities that we already have. We can say, and there is a lot of literature on this in the last 2 years, that there has been a shift from the reader, before the reader paid, or the institutions or the persons, to the author pay. And what we now have is a lot of studies in a national basis that have made estimations. And so we have like a projection of the APC costs for different countries. The truth is that from the perspective of one country, I don't know if I have not found an analysis for Germany, but you have for many countries, and for Latin America for at least 7 or 8 countries. And I know also a study for France. And so you can know how much your country is paying, but it is a projection that you take from the journals, but you never know if one has a waiver, if the other one, maybe that article was paid by another one because there is a lot of collaboration. But what we do know is that the oligopolies, the most important 5 oligopolies in the scientific industry, publishing industry, have received from this new management model 1.06 billion in publication fees. I mean, that is not a projection. That is what they have indeed received. And so in just 4 year and a period analyzed by this study that I'm quoting at the end of this slide. And so I would like to focus now on Latin America, if you allow me, because it is a region I really deeply know. And I would like to show you in the way that I think that we may be a possibility to explain why an open science with autonomy, but at the same time, you know, in a conflictive coexistence with heteronomy, because that is, as I see the academic fields right now. But what are the advantages and what are the problems that we have in Latin America in order to advance to open science? First of all, it would be very interesting in 2 or 3 minutes to try to understand and maybe in a comparison with Europe, 2 intellectual spaces that are really very important right now in the world, Europe and Latin America. If you look at Latin America has been an intellectual space for at least 200 years. So we have an intellectual space with intensive communication, at least since 1798, because it was the period of the epistolar type of communication. You know, letters were the only way, and there we're speaking, of course, of our independent leaders and particularly the military. But I'm talking about Bolívar, San Martín, Belgrano, the big leaders, and they wrote many letters in which they could think on our continent as also as an identity entity. And so from that part on to all the 19th century and the beginnings of the 20th century, we really have the identity of being part of the same history. And this same history that we have has a lot to do with colonization and with the idea that we always have things in common and a common enemy. And enemy is always outside Latin America. The enemy can be, first of all, the British or the Spaniards and then the United States, but there's always like a sense of history as a struggle, no? Right? And of course, during these 2 centuries, exile has been very important in terms of the communication within the region and the construction of this intellectual space. The university reform, and that's the only thing I'm going to quote in the beginning of the 20th century, which is 1918, was a continental movement. And this continental movement created what we can call or open the idea of autonomy and the relation of what I'm trying to argue right now, which is the relation between autonomy and freedom. Because in this university reform of 1918, that was not only in the South, it started in Argentina, but it continued in the whole continent of Latin America, reaching even Mexico. And so all these movements were student movements, but they really changed completely the morphology of their universities. First of all, they stand for institutional autonomy. That's the main definition of autonomy for Latin America and the Latin American tradition. And this institutional autonomy is always thought in relation of the field of power, always in relation to the government. The university has to have this institutional autonomy in relation to the government. And it was very important later on because we had these military dictatorships. And so the university always has been autonomous in terms of resisting the military interventions. But at that time, 1918, there was also a very local type of autonomy that was standard for. And that was the freedom of chair, which is, I think in the German system, you also have chairs still. Well, in Latin America, we also have chairs, a system of chairs, and many universities have advanced to the idea of departments, but many have not, especially in the big public universities. And so the freedom of chair means that each professor has a freedom of thought and can say in his class whatever he wants. And so that started there, and it is still like a very long discussion that we can take until today, and that is related to open science also. And as I was saying, from 1918, we have public universities that are self and co-governed, which is by a council with the students, with the professors, and with in some cases the graduates, and in some cases the personnel, the administrative staff represented in this council. Now, if we go a bit more by the mid-20th century, there was a very important thing that happened in Latin America, and it is what we call regionalization. This is that we started to create regional institutions that were completely formed by the governments or by the universities within themselves. For example, the Latin American Faculty of Social Science, very well known FLACSO, the CLACSO, which is the Latin American Council of Social Sciences. There were also networks of mathematicians. It was not only a social sciences issue, this regional type of institutions, and of course, the very important Economic Commission for Latin America that was created in 1948, and other like ILPE, CELADE. And so all these regional institutions were also accompanied by a very important regional publishing industry. So we have a long-standing tradition of books, of publishing, of book publishing, and there, especially in social science. For example, the Fund of Economic Culture or Siglo XXI, and we had regional prizes, academic prizes. So what you can find by maybe the beginning of 1960 is that we do have a regional type of prestige, the Latin American type of prestige that is very important in some disciplines still today. And that was created in the 1960s. Also, of course, as you can imagine, the 60s is the period of the discussion of the national autonomy. So now there is another facet of autonomy that is very present here, which is, well, is there a national autonomy in terms of the country's autonomy? I mean, Argentinian academic field should be autonomous from other academic fields. It's not normally a discussion between Argentina and Brazil or Argentina and Mexico. Of course, it is between our countries and the main countries that are supposedly the creators of the original concepts. And, you know, this discussion of the national autonomy came when also ideas like the brain drain came to us, and the idea of replicability, that we needed to create our own ideas and our own concepts. And so in this moment, academic autonomy became a discussion towards the defense of the national autonomy. And in the more recent times, you can see that in the 70s, and the end of the 70s, we had the first Latin American indexing systems created by the big universities, the public universities in Brazil and in Mexico. So by the end of the 70s, we had our own Latin American indexing systems, when Web of Science was still maybe in the beginnings, because Web of Science is from the Science Citation Index is 1964. And so our indexing systems are 1973, 1976. So we had our own indexing systems, Clase and Periódica. And in the 90s, the first digital platforms for journals, which is Cielo, Redalic, and Latindex. And so we have a movement of open access that has already more than 20, 25 years of existence. Anyways, in the 1990s, many things changes, because the idea of academic globalization, the idea of the mainstream circuit imposed within the research assessment systems created like what we could say like a double face situation for Latin America. In the social sciences, the Latin American circuit, the Latin American journals are really dominant and important, because if you publish in an indexed journal in Latin America, well, it is important. You can really gain this regional prestige. But in the other disciplines, you only are directed to publishing outside Latin America and in English. And so the region became dominated in the mainstream circuit, but dominating within this regional circuit that is mostly valuable for the social sciences and the Spanish production, of course. Now, I would just like to finish this review on the Latin American history or the intellectual history, saying that it is true that we do not export as much knowledge as we would like to. And there is a negative relation between the imports and the exports of knowledge. But when you do not export a lot of knowledge, and if we try to sort out of this economicist type of thinking, if you really do not export too much, that does not mean immediately that you're importing everything. I mean, you do not export your knowledge, but you're not necessarily you're importing knowledge. I mean, you can produce knowledge in your endogenous type of kind of production, even if it's not internationally exported. And I will try to explain that now. So how is this related to the discussion on the idea of autonomy, freedom, and coloniality of knowledge? I would like to advance that I do not agree with the formulation of the idea of coloniality of knowledge. I agree, of course, with Aníbal Quijano's idea of coloniality of power, which is, I think, absolutely clear. But the idea of coloniality of knowledge means, or the academic imperialism means, that we have really a radical work to do in order to find the southern knowledge, right? And that we are really colonized in terms of knowledge. And I think that I've been trying to show that if we have 200 years of development of an intellectual space, what we have is, as Quijano said, and other dependentists in our intellectual tradition have said or argued, we have structural heterogeneity, which is autonomy and heteronomy are conflictly living together, right? And so here I was just trying to show you that in this figure, the green one, if you believe that that big sphere, then the green one is the academic world. If you see it, even if from a southern critique, you can see that the mainstream circuit is always in the top, is always with this hierarchy that we believe is in the top, and peripheral science is in the bottom, because there has been a very intensive work to try to create the idea that peripheral science, marginal science, is everything that's outside these data sources that were created in the mainstream circuit. So if you publish in a journal that is in Web of Science, you're going to be in the top because you are publishing in these journals with a very high impact factor. If you publish outside there, you're peripheral, you're marginal, you're nothing. But if you look at this, how do you say conjunto in English? the sphere that is in the middle, the brown one, which I just put the example of Argentina because it's a very interesting example. The national field in Argentina, the one that's in the middle, even if we have had forced internationalization and we have a very internationalized elite, we still have local circuits. We still have journals that 2 or 3 years were edited in paper, and they have readers, and they are they have what I call there a local prestige, but they're still valid, and these professors are still working, are still in the university, right? So we still have these local circuits. So somebody has to be accepting these type of professors and journals. We also have this kind of national prestige that I've put in quotes, because it is really nationally recognized at CONICET, which is our main research agency in the country. So indeed, we have what we could call a national prestige, because if you are a CONICET researcher, well, you are consolidated as such, and international publishing is expected. But that doesn't mean that international prestige is really gained. I mean, for the peripheral countries or semi-peripheral countries, this is very questionable. If you publish in English and on all these mainstream journals, are you really gaining international prestige? That would be a question. It couldn't be an affirmation, right? And on the other side, for the social sciences, there is still at work this regional prestige that is very important, and we have a lot of institutions that really boost this regional prestige. So if you look at this situation and you look at the Argentinian field that I'm trying to draw here, you can see that the evaluative cultures, the research assessment is defining a lot. How diverse are these circuits in each country? How big are the local circuits or very small? How big are the local languages in which you publish? I would like to build the same thing for Germany, but you should do it with me. But I would like to see how much of these local circuits you have, how much of the German publishing you have. I think that in Germany, you really have had a very important resistance to the impositions of heteronomous type of indicators. So I believe you do have diverse circuits. And so I think that in general, what we have here is a possibility of diverse circuits, but open access can change completely this landscape. If open access or open science is now proposing a new type of publishing, and this new type of publishing is going to affect all this figure that I was showing you of our, for example, Argentinian national field, what are our options and what can we do to make open science a really positive evolution? I would like to show you now the potential of Latin America in this sense. and the global discussion of open access journals. Do you remember this issue that we had about APC? If you go to the Opera's report that was published in 2021, you can see that you have diamond journals. These diamond journals are the journals that are free to read and free to publish. I mean, they are sustained by a university. You don't have to pay for anything, for paying, nor for reading, nor for publishing. And so if you can see these numbers, they're very little, but I would like to make a comparison, particularly with Western Europe, which is the last one. You can have in green the ones that are indeed diamond journals, and the other ones, the yellow ones, the ones that are with APC. So in Western Europe, you have 2,300 diamond and 1,907 journals with APC. As you can see, you have a lot of diamond journals. I don't know how much of them are known by the community in order to publish there. But in Latin America, it's the only region in which you have most of them in diamond and only 130 with APC. The new work we've made, the new study shows we have 187. This is for today, right? But of 3,000 journals, it's really a very, very, very small part. And now let's focus on the issue of language. You know, the battle of language is really important here, but not only for the global South, for the globe. It is a very important thing because you can see here, I'm just recalling some of the debates on this major issue, but we have a consensus, and the recommendation of Open Science has put that in paper, that the hypercentrality of English is a really important cultural loss. I mean, there is a devaluation of the the books and the publications in national language, which has a very, very important consequence in terms of the content, in terms of the results, and especially in terms of the social relevance of the research. I mean, in terms of the agenda, the research agenda. And so I'm just mentioning here the initiatives that have been at work in this sense. But now my question is, it's true that hypercentrality of English is a fact, but is this the unique reality? If you look at Latin America and you change the focus, you broaden the data sources, and you go outside EASY or Web of Science and Scopus, you can see that there are a lot of articles published in Spanish and in Portuguese. The problem is the value that they have for research assessment, but in truth, the publications exist. So what I did here in the first two rows that are marked in red is just to make a comparison between the Spanish articles that you can find in Scopus, in Web of Science, and then in Oliva. Oliva is a database that we built with all the journals and documents from Cielo and Redalic, which are the two Latin American indexation systems that we have today. BibLat is another indexation system that we also worked with, but they are not interoperable, so we cannot, see overlappings. They have to be at the moment just worked separately. And so, but you can see that we have more than almost the same amount of Spanish papers in Cielo, Redalic, and in Scopus, for example. This is the total collection in every case. And in Portuguese, of course, very marginal, and very more important in Cielo and Redalic, and of course also in BibLat. And so, in BibLat, but where Portuguese is more important is in La Referencia, which is our federation of repositories. This is a very important regional network that we have that is working with the support of the governments. This is a public organization, and it includes 12 governments of the country, of the region, and it harvests the institutional repositories of these 12 countries. And so you have more than 800 institutional repositories at today, because I only put there the articles, but you have more than 3 million documents. But most of these documents are master dissertations or doctoral dissertations. But if you focus only on articles, you have 531,000 articles in Portuguese. So we do have a lot of production in these languages. What is the problem? Even if we have Redalic, even if we have Cielo, Biblat, Latindex, all these indexing systems that are created in Latin America, supported by our governments, which is their public organizations, and La Referencia that I was mentioning there, we have all these platforms and infrastructure to build open science in a collaborative way. But we also have 10 countries which have what we call the research categorization systems. These are national systems for the categorization, which are supposed to overcome the institutional autonomy of the universities. You know, the idea from the 90s on to until today was to try to create evaluation criteria that could overcome the institutional autonomy created in the reform in 1918. And so in these 10 countries, including Argentina, even though Argentina has a particularly different situation for the social sciences, all these journals that I mentioned and all these efforts that are made by our countries sustaining Redalic, Cielo, and Latindex are not valued because they are only accepting the publications that are with impact factor and with all these indicators like index H index and the rankings for the journals, right? And so we have like going to the end of this, we have like you know, in the open science recommendation, we always say we have to alienate, I mean, to go to several actions in order to advance in open science. But I mean, philosophically, I'm trying to say we have like an alienation because we are putting all these efforts in public organizations and in journal platforms and collaborative type of infrastructure, but we're not valuing them in the evaluative systems or in the research systems, right? And so a last word here, or not exactly last word, but the last piece on one of the facets or the sides of open science that is very important for Latin America, which is citizen science, this idea of openness to the society. And also, what relationship has this with the idea of autonomy? And citizen science in the recommendation is mostly thought as the openness to social sectors and the idea really to co-create science, but it's not really well developed. It depends, of course, on the interpretation of each country and each community. In Latin America, for us, the most important part or idea of citizen science is the idea of participatory science, but not in the sense of the invitation to certain group to participate with a scientist. But we have two traditions that are helping in this sense to create our own tradition of citizen science. One of them is participatory research action. Maybe you know that there is a tradition, globally well known, of participatory research. But in the 1970s, Orlando Falsborda, which is a Colombian sociologist, created the idea of adding the word action to this participatory research that you can maybe know in different type of interpretations, but normally it's just the social science research that is made through participation. But he added the idea of action because the participatory research action means not to invite people, but to really co-build knowledge and to make an intervention in this reality, but not the scientists from the ivory tower on to the people, but really in a co-construction. And so that's one of the most important traditions in terms of social sciences that can help here. And the other one is universitary extension. This is not, in English, it's not very well translated, but we don't have an English word for that. You call that third mission in English, or service. But in Europe and in the United States, service or third mission has been fading in the 20th century until now. that sometimes has been resurrected. But in Latin America, this third mission started to gain strength in the university reform in 1918. And it has always maintained this strength. I mean, until today, extension, university extension is a very important, is one of the substantial missions of the university. It has always had its own budget. And with these type of projects that are called extension projects, the universities, the public universities in all Latin America have long-lasting interactions with the community. They have like maybe relations with the local communities for 20 or 30 years in a continuous type of way. And so I think that really we do have there a very important place in which we can co-create science, and we can really create a Latin American tradition of participatory science. Now, I would like to say a few words on the problem of social sciences and open science. I think we have to discuss some of the resistances that we have for open sciences. Maybe our social sciences and humanities have been more related to individual type of work, and so open science is creating a challenge there. And sometimes we are afraid of ethical issues or the problems related to the protection of the subjects. But I'm not going to go in deep on that because of the time. The last thing I would like to say relating to citizen science is that indigenous knowledge is not part of this citizen science that we're talking about. In the expert committee, when we discussed this, many experts thought that it was important to include indigenous knowledge in the idea of open science. But if we did that, and that's where the Latin Americans and many other people from the Global South initiated a discussion here, if we did that, well, what about the autonomy of the communities and their knowledge? Because are we asking the indigenous communities to participate in a traditional type of open science system? Why? And that is where these care principles came here. You know, the FAIR principles are the most important principles of open science, but the care principles came here to solve this issue on how to respect the authority and the governance of the data within the indigenous communities. And going now to the conclusions, I would like to say that if you remember the figure that I showed, in which you had an arrow that was going from north to south, or from up to that, from up to the bottom, it's necessary to think of open science with a plurality of agendas, contextual assessment, of course, and the diverse circuits of production and circulation. But in order to achieve that, it is necessary to invert this arrow of the decision of quality and excellence. I mean, who is defining the excellence of science? Is it defined by international standards? Well, we cannot just leave them aside, of course, but we can build an equilibrium between international standards, local needs, and also local standards, even national standards. So we should try to revert the order of the operation, right? And think from bottom to up. And that's why the figure that I showed you, in which the north was always in the mainstream circuit and the south was always in the peripheral or the marginal type of science, I think that's not really truth, because if we always think in that, even in the most critical parts of the South, the global South, we are accepting the fact that in the North we have autonomy, we have originality, we have, you know, the mainstream is really the most relevant and hierarchical, while in the South we have no relevance. And I think that we have to change that, as in this circle that you're seeing is that, you know, those old TV shows that you could just go around this, it was like a game that you could just go around this thing and select things and make different selections and you won a prize. Well, I'm saying, let's just think these diverse circuits and the research assessment as a combination, like a spinning wheel, that we have to go around in each country, in each institution, even in the local level, and decide in the multiscalarity that we have in each national field, what type of combination we want. And so we need to revert the values of this forced internationalization to restitute the link between excellence and social needs. And in our case, of course, also repatriate some extracted data that we have, because scientific sovereignty is also important. And finally, regarding indigenous knowledge, to protect and respect. So thank you for everything.
Thank you very much. I don't want to keep us a long time from the discussion. What I found interesting is are two things. And I have two questions as well, adding to the questions of our students and of our colleagues. The first thing is, what I find very interesting is the take on your argument, or as I understand your argument, is because you don't see much of our research in your place doesn't mean that we don't have research in our own place, which is interesting, because the whole academic dependency, or let's say academic dependency debate, has some very strong Latin American activists like Walter Mignolo, who works at Columbia-University and not in Latin America. As I know from my own research, is that this whole academic debate, dependency debate, was imported, let's say, to Africa in their intellectual circuits in the 1960s by Samia Amin, who was an economist and who was adopting the economic dependency debate. And then the Beninese philosopher Paul Ntonji, he said, well, this could also refer to academic dependency. So there seemed to be some similarity, and I guess we have to go deeper into comparing regions. You're pointing to the age of more than 200 years of intellectual discussion. I wonder whether this is also true for Southeast Asia and others, but those are not my questions, just two framing comments. I think it's very fitting your presentation, because we're at the Berlin-University Alliance, and the aim of the Berlin-University Alliance is to create an integrated research area, which is strong enough to not only answer international questions, like we have one large aim of tackling global health, which is, of course, at some day will affect us, or is already affecting us, but also how does social cohesion work in here, within Berlin. And there are many researchers working on this at the moment, being funded by the Berlin-University Alliance. And in our objective, we're thinking about research assessment reforms. And I think that's a very interesting point, is to have to differentiate or balance between international and local activities, because in my opinion, I have the, or at least I have the impression, is that this local circuit is always a bit underestimated, undervalued. But we have many researchers in our Berlin research area who work locally, be it like Germany or for expertise. We even have like data for this by our survey we just had. This gives us a good idea of balancing. There was just two things, is maybe you say that we don't see your research. If we don't see your research, doesn't mean you don't do research. Some of the bibliometric studies not only look at, do you publish in high-ranking journals, but they always look at citation patterns. So if there's a citation pattern within the Latin American region that is supporting the Latin American region, meaning that Argentinian physicists cite Brazilian physicists, cite Peruvian physicists. So are there is there a reception among each other? Or is it just like internal, external description? And the second one, do you know anything about disciplines? Because some disciplinary development has been very international, some others don't. You speak from the perspective of social sciences, but like high particle physics, there are only a few places in the world where you can do this. Those were only like two questions, the others were remarks. And do you want to quickly respond to this, or should we collect the questions from our students? Okay, then I would ask Felice, if you are among us, to maybe select one of your questions to and ask it right away.
Yes, I'm here digitally. So if I choose one, it's so throughout the text, there were like the solution was basically offered to move towards these contextualized evaluation criteria. And I think that was like a really interesting read. So thank you for that. But I was wondering, what role can individuals in academia in the global north play, and how can they contribute?
Okay, Zoe, would you also add to this question round?
Yes, so I have one question which is referring to one quote, which is, secondly, by promoting the pluralization of criteria to reflect the different academic practices, which are part of science according to the types of research institutions and the interdisciplinary nature and the diversity of links with society. And I was wondering, how can the associated complexity of the evaluation be addressed, or in other words, how to deal with the trade-off between a more context-specific assessment and a certain uniformity and standardization of evaluation.
Could you repeat it, please? The last one. Or...
Yes. So my question was, how can the associated complexity of the evaluation rest, or how to deal with the trade-off between a more context-specific assessment and a certain uniformity and standardization?
Yes, thank you. I just, in the case of Zoe, I had some interruptions, so I didn't understand the first time. Thank you very much. First of all, regarding your comments, Stefan, I really find that in research assessment relies most of the problems. It's like it's very difficult to change, but it depends a lot on not only in public policies, not only in the intentions of the universities, but also in individuals. And that will take me to one of the questions. But regarding how much are we reading ourselves, and this bibliometric studies that could give an answer to this. Well, the main problem we have, and I tried to put that in one of the slides, is data source, because the bibliometric studies that are made on Web of Science or Scopus, well, they all reach mostly the same conclusion, which is, first of all, Latin Americans are publishing in Latin American indexed journals very little. Within Scopus, I mean on Web of Science. They tend to publish in the non-Latin American journals, and the coverage of Web of Science and Scopus of social sciences and humanities is very, very little comparing to other disciplines, and especially in Spanish and in Portuguese. So we have that, but the problem is that we don't have other big systems in which we can find all these diverse circuits. And the ones that my team has found now, and we're doing exploratory studies, are these CRIS systems, which is the curriculum type of database that I don't know in Germany which one you have. But for example, in the comparative studies that we've made, we have from Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, these national databases of curriculum. The problem or the difficulty is that these are not bibliometric type of databases. These are self-uploaded type of databases. But we have worked with a bibliometric laboratory in order to detect really individually each article. You can do that if they have the DOI. So we had to limit all the analysis to the articles with a DOI, with a DOI. But we find the coverage more than 50% on top of Web of Science, Scopus. And I cannot answer in detail now because we are at work, but we already have a very, very important database now that the coverage is almost the double of Scopus and Web of Science for Chile, for Argentina and Brazil now. And what we have seen is that when you, for example, for Brazil, when you compare the Brazilian and the Argentinians, there is a very important difference. So Argentinians publish internationally and collaborate a lot internationally. Instead, in Brazil, you find that most of the authors are Brazilians. That does not necessarily mean endogamy, because they come, for example, from the University of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, which is like two countries of a distance. So it is national collaboration, but it's not, to me, it's not endogamy. And so this type of interinstitutional collaboration is most normal in Brazil, but it is a national type of collaboration. And they publish a lot in national journals in Brazil. In Argentina, they mostly publish in international journals, even in Latin American journals. But I can't tell you yet in detail in terms of bibliometric citation, because we were working on that. But we have built this major database in order to surpass the limitations of Web of Science and Scope. So maybe in a few months I can tell you more. What I do see is that we have disciplines that are more international, of course. Even mathematics are disciplines that tend to have a more international agenda, and you have differences, of course. But also you can see that in the disciplines of the exact sciences or the biology, for example, they have a problem with the APC that is particular to them, because the biology and health sciences, for example, are the ones that are suffering the APC more than other disciplines. So you also have in these disciplines, they do not have to be as international as others, because they are working with phenomena that can have to do with the public health and the local situations. But they do have internationally a very big problem comparing to others. And the study of APC in France shows the same situation. 62% of all the APCs paid in France, in Argentina, are 62% of the total coming from the biology and health sciences. I don't know if in Germany is the same situation, but we have a huge problem there, and we've been working in order to find actions to solve it. And along with the issue of citations, in 2 or 3 months, I can send you something new, I hope. We're working in that, and we're not working only in social sciences and humanities. This database is for all disciplines. So I hope we can say something more. What we had proved already, and I was telling Romain Faure, was that we already have proved this with the bibliometric study for gender asymmetries. So we can tell you the relationship between the population of researchers, the women researchers, and how they appear in Google Scholar. We worked in the citations in Google Scholar in order to, broaden up the analysis of Scopus or Web of Science. And I will show on Wednesday our results in terms of gender asymmetries. That's something we did finish already. But regarding the individual contribution, I think it's a very interesting question of one of the students, because you sometimes ask, well, how can we change this, at least from the space we are? Well, in the case of the professors that are here, we all are part of evaluation committees. We are part of tenure competitions or any kind of committee for example, for evaluating projects. And if you go to that level, I have made a lot of ethnographical type of observation in evaluation committees. And the problem is not necessarily in the policies that are coming from the institution, but in the small committees in which people really, the professors, really believe that the impact factor and that the mainstream journals are the most prestigious and the most important ones. So in the individual action, you can really work on discussing this about the relevance. For example, I don't know if you've been aware of the discussion made in the journal Quantitative Studies of Science around the paper that was rejected in Scientometrics, because it showed that Scopus also had a lot of predatory journals. And so just, discussing all these things and discussing with our professors and our peers and our peer students also, in order to show them that we have to prioritize the local needs also and even the national needs, and not only this global agenda. I think that we have a lot of importance in individual contributions. And regarding the question of, I think it was the complexity, the contextualization and standardization, it's not an easy answer there, because we sometimes, for example, this national research categorizations that we have in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and many countries, is the only opportunity that a young person has to have tenure as a researcher. It's a research position that this person is applying for. And so you have maybe in one discipline, for example, I don't know, in sociology, you have 150 candidates and you only have 10 posts for that. And so how can you make a fair evaluation without some quantitative type of indicators? The discussion today around the world is that we need an equilibrium also between qualitative and quantitative assessment. We cannot just forget about quantitative, at least in these type of competitions. It's very different when you evaluate projects, very different, but when you're evaluating persons and a competition for a position, is some quantitative indicators may be needed. And I think that these type of standardizations sometimes are needed, but the complexity of the context means that we, in order to really be able to understand the complexity and the contextualization, we have to just try to change the composition of these committees. I mean, you can't have a national committee to evaluate absolutely all type of projects and institutions. And the only way is really to diversify also the research assessment system, I think. Thank you.